5 boys attacked the new girl at McDonald's. Moments later, the whole school was stunned. The surveillance footage would capture exactly 7.8 seconds of pure calculated violence. 7.8 seconds for Marina Keene to systematically dismantle 5 Division I athletic recruits using nothing more than a plastic fast food tray and an understanding of human anatomy that no 17-year-old should possess. But the McDonald's shift manager already had his hand hovering over the emergency call button the moment he saw them surrounding her booth, because something in the girl's stillness reminded him of a nature documentary he'd once watched about apex predators conserving energy before the strike. Marina remained motionless as French fries scattered across the cracked tile floor like spent shell casings. A chocolate milkshake painted abstract patterns across the ceiling tiles, dripping slowly onto the industrial gray tables below. Dominic Blackwood lay crumpled at her feet, his nose bent at an angle that would require extensive reconstructive surgery and a lifetime of explaining why his breathing whistled in cold weather. The star quarterback, who'd been recruited by 3 Ivy League schools, couldn't even manage to twitch properly, his nervous system struggling to reboot after what had just happened to it. 3 weeks before this moment of spectacular violence, Marina had walked through the iron gates of Thornfield Institute, carrying a leather satchel that cost more than most of the faculty cars in the parking lot. Her honey blonde hair caught the morning light in a way that made the morning jog club stumble over their own feet. Standing barely 5'3", she moved with the kind of fluid precision that suggested years of classical ballet training, which was exactly what her meticulously crafted admission documents claimed. Former student at the Budapest Academy of Dance, the paperwork stated. Father worked in international finance. Mother tragically deceased in a car accident. Seeking a fresh start after a minor scandal involving leaked examination materials at her previous school. The admissions committee had been thoroughly charmed by her perfect transcripts, her fluency in 6 languages, and particularly by the substantial donation that had accompanied her application, wired from an account in Switzerland that would have been very difficult to trace if anyone had bothered trying. They'd assigned her to the honors dormitory, given her a prime locker in the main hallway, and assumed she would integrate seamlessly into their carefully cultivated ecosystem of privilege and predetermined success. They hadn't noticed during her campus tour how her eyes tracked every security camera's field of vision, cataloging blind spots with the efficiency of someone planning either a heist or an escape route. They missed the way she tested the tension on her locker's hinges 3 separate times, checking for any signs of tampering or weakness. They didn't observe how she mapped the library's layout with military precision, identifying which windows could be opened, which stairwells had the best acoustic properties for detecting approaching footsteps, and which corners provided optimal defensive positions. The library would become her primary sanctuary. 3 stories of oak shelving and leather-bound volumes that reeked of old money and older secrets. She'd claimed a study carrel on the 2nd floor, positioned with her back to a solid wall and clear sightlines to both the main staircase and the emergency exit concealed behind a portrait of Thornfield's founder, a steel magnate who'd made his fortune selling to both sides during World War I. Most students assumed she chose that particular spot for the natural light that streamed through the nearby windows. They had no idea she was following protocols that had been drilled into her since she was 9 years old. Rules written in languages she'd learned not from textbooks, but from handlers who smelled of cigarettes and gun oil. Her first week at Thornfield passed without significant incident. She attended classes with perfect punctuality, took notes in handwriting so precise it could have been printed by a machine, and politely deflected every social invitation with vague mentions of jet lag and the need to adjust to the American educational system. The other students quickly categorized her as another international student, struggling with cultural integration. Beautiful enough to be noticed, but too reserved to be worth pursuing. That assessment changed dramatically when Dominic Blackwood decided she was going to be his next acquisition. Standing 6'3" with the kind of bone structure that belonged on Renaissance sculptures rather than football fields, Dominic ruled Thornfield Institute with the casual sociopathy of someone who'd been told he was special since the moment he'd learned to walk. His father, Judge William Blackwood, had graduated from Thornfield 32 years ago and still donated enough money annually to ensure that his son's various transgressions were classified as youthful exuberance rather than warning signs of something darker. His mother sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and 4 charities, positions that gave the family access to the kind of information that could destroy careers with a single leaked document. Dominic collected things with the methodical patience of a serial killer, organizing trophies, vintage watches that had belonged to dead industrialists, first edition books he never read but displayed like hunting trophies, and girls who made the fatal error of catching his attention. He had developed a system over his 4 years at Thornfield, refined through repetition into something approaching an exact science. Phase 1 always began with overwhelming displays of wealth and access. Designer bouquets delivered to lockers, invitations to events that senators attended, promises of connections that could reshape futures. When that failed, which it rarely did, given the ambitious nature of most Thornfield students, came Phase 2, systematic isolation. Study groups would suddenly be full when certain students tried to join. Lunch tables would mysteriously have no empty seats. Teachers would develop selective blindness to raised hands and outstanding assignments. Most targets cracked within a week, accepting his attention just to make their academic lives bearable again. The few who held out longer faced Phase 3, which Dominic privately called pressure testing, and which usually involved his carefully selected crew of fellow athletes. The crew consisted of 4 other students, each chosen for specific qualities that complemented Dominic's particular brand of psychological warfare. Marcus Henley, universally known as Brick, for reasons that became obvious the moment you saw him, stood 6'6" and weighed nearly 300 pounds of muscle mass that had already secured him a full scholarship to play football at Ohio State. His role was simple but effective, pure physical intimidation, using his size to make people understand just how small and fragile they really were. Ryder Cross played defensive end on the field and enforcer everywhere else. He had a talent for violence that stayed just barely within the boundaries of plausible deniability, leaving behind a trail of injuries that could always be explained as accidents or misunderstandings. His juvenile record had been sealed by Judge Blackwood personally, though whispers followed him about an incident at his previous school involving a teacher who'd failed him and subsequently spent 3 months in intensive care after a mysterious fall down a flight of stairs. Preston Vale brought connections rather than muscle to the group. His father owned the largest construction company in the state and had enough blackmail material on local politicians to ensure that any complaint against his son would disappear into administrative limbo. Preston's presence meant institutional protection, the guarantee that any accusation would be met with lawyers expensive enough to bankrupt most families before a case ever reached trial. Felix Ashford completed the group, and despite being the smallest at just under 6 feet, he was perhaps the most dangerous. While the others relied on physical intimidation or family connections, Felix specialized in psychological destruction. He had a gift for finding the exact pressure point that would shatter someone's mental stability. Whether it was a secretly gay father, a mother's addiction history, or a sibling's learning disability. He collected secrets like other people collected stamps, and he deployed them with surgical precision. Together, they formed what other students privately called the Thornfield Elite, though never within earshot of anyone who might report back to them. They moved through campus like sharks through a reef, taking what they wanted, destroying what bored them, protected by money, connections, and an administration that had learned to look the other way rather than risk losing millions in donations. Marina appeared on their radar during her 2nd week when she made the tactical error of being beautiful while walking past their regular table in the dining hall. Dominic's eyes tracked her movement with the focused intensity of a predator identifying prey, already calculating approaches, considering angles, planning the campaign that would end with another trophy for his collection. The operation began the following Monday with a bouquet of white orchids that cost more than most students' monthly allowances, delivered to her locker with a handwritten card in Dominic's practiced calligraphy. The message was simple, but loaded with implication. Coffee at Marcello's, 7 p.m. Friday. A car will be waiting. Marcello's was the kind of restaurant that didn't advertise, didn't need reservations because they chose their clientele, and regularly hosted the kind of people who appeared on Currency. Marina read the card once, her expression revealing nothing, then dropped it in the nearest trash can along with the flowers, leaving them to wilt in the hallway like rejected offerings to an indifferent god. Dominic, watching from his usual position near the trophy cases, felt something he rarely experienced. Genuine surprise followed immediately by interest. Girls at Thornfield didn't reject his invitations. They screenshot them, posted them on social media with carefully crafted captions about feeling blessed, used them as social currency to elevate their status within the school's complex hierarchy. This required recalibration of his approach. Phase 1 continued for 3 more days, with increasingly elaborate offerings. Tickets to a Broadway opening that had been sold out for months. An invitation to his mother's charity gala where she could network with people who could guarantee her acceptance to any university in the world. A tennis bracelet from Cartier that appeared in her locker with no note, just the assumption that she would understand its meaning and implications. Each gift was either returned unopened or simply abandoned wherever she found it, as if these tokens of wealth and access meant less to her than the gum stuck under her desk. By Thursday, the entire school was aware of what was happening. Social media buzzed with speculation about the new girl who was somehow immune to Dominic Blackwood's influence. Bets were placed in secret group chats about how long she could hold out. His crew started making jokes, careful to keep them quiet, but not careful enough to prevent Dominic from hearing. His reputation, meticulously constructed over 4 years of calculated victories, was developing hairline fractures. Friday morning brought Phase 2. Marina arrived at her usual table in the library to find it occupied by a study group that seemed to multiply whenever she approached, their books and laptops spreading across the surface like an advancing army claiming territory. The computer lab was suddenly fully booked for the entire day, despite several terminals sitting empty. Her name mysteriously vanished from the advanced chemistry lab sign-up sheet, forcing her to complete experiments during lunch when the room was empty and the teaching assistant was nowhere to be found. She adapted without visible frustration, eating alone in empty classrooms, studying in whatever spaces existed between the occupied territories, completing her coursework with the same mechanical precision that characterized everything she did. The isolation might have broken someone else, but Marina had been alone since the night her mother died in a hotel room in Bucharest, the victim of a car bomb meant for her father. She'd spent the years since moving between safe houses and training facilities, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections that could become vulnerabilities. If anything, the enforced solitude felt familiar, almost comfortable, like slipping into a well-worn jacket that fit perfectly despite its ugly appearance. She established a routine with military precision: classes from 8 to 3, library from 3:30 to 5, gym from 5:30 to 7, then back to her dormitory where she would complete assignments and review the day's intelligence, though anyone watching would have seen only a teenage girl doing homework. She ate the same meals at the same times, took the same routes between buildings, maintained the same expression of polite disinterest that gave away nothing about what she was thinking or planning. It was during one of her library sessions that Phase 3 began in earnest. The space was nearly empty, just Marina at her usual table, and a few scattered underclassmen on the first floor, cramming for a history test. She was working through a calculus problem that would have challenged most college students when shadows fell across her work. All 5 of them had positioned themselves strategically, blocking every obvious exit route, or so they believed. Dominic pulled out the chair directly across from her and sat down with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been denied anything he wanted. The others remained standing, brick behind her left shoulder, close enough that she could smell the protein shake on his breath. Ryder at her right within grabbing distance, Preston blocking the path to the main stairs, and Felix positioned near the emergency exit she'd identified on her first day, his phone already recording what they assumed would be her capitulation. The conversation began with Dominic's attempt at charm, his voice pitched to the frequency that had worked on dozens of girls before her. He explained how Thornfield really worked, the importance of connections, the doors that could open or remain forever closed based on the friends you made or enemies you accumulated. Marina continued working on her calculus problem, her pencil moving across the page with steady precision, as if he were nothing more than background noise, no different from the air conditioning or the distant sound of traffic outside. When she finally looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that revealed nothing but seemed to see everything, her response was delivered in a tone of such complete disinterest that Felix actually stopped recording for a moment, unsure if his phone was malfunctioning. She told them she understood perfectly what they wanted, what they represented, and what they thought they could take from her. She just didn't care. The dismissal was so complete, so utterly without fear or concern, that for a moment none of them knew how to respond. Then she began packing her materials with unhurried movements, each book placed in her bag with the kind of care someone might use handling old photographs or explosive devices. When Preston moved to block her path more obviously, she walked directly toward him with such certainty that at the last moment, his nerve broke and he stepped aside, later telling himself it was strategic rather than admitting he'd been intimidated by someone who barely came up to his chest. The weekend that followed crackled with tension. Marina maintained her routine, spending Saturday at the public library downtown, where Thornfield's influence didn't reach, working through assignments that she could have completed in her sleep, but which maintained her cover as a dedicated student. Sunday found her at a gym at 5 a.m, moving through a workout that would have exhausted professional athletes. 2 hours of cardio that pushed her heart rate to the edge of what was safe, followed by strength training that seemed impossible for someone her size, and flexibility work that would have made gymnasts envious. She didn't notice Felix watching from his car in the parking lot, documenting her routine with the patience of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency in any conflict. He noted the way she checked her surroundings every 30 seconds like clockwork, the defensive positioning of her water bottle and towel that would allow her to use them as weapons if necessary, the fact that she never wore headphones despite being alone, maintaining complete awareness of her environment at all times. These weren't the habits of a diplomat's daughter worried about academic performance. These were the behaviors of someone who'd been hunted and had learned to hunt in return. Monday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more dangerous. Marina walked through Thornfield's gates at exactly 7:45, 15 minutes before first period, her timing as precise as everything else about her carefully maintained identity. She didn't notice the anticipation thrumming through the student body like electricity before a storm, the way conversations died when she passed, the phones already recording in case something memorable happened. The Thornfield elite had spent the weekend planning something special, and word had spread through carefully orchestrated leaks that today would be the day the new girl learned her place in the ecosystem. The first escalation came during second period chemistry, when Marina opened her textbook to find photographs tucked between the pages. Not threatening exactly, but unsettling in their implications. Pictures of her at the public library, reading at a corner table, at the gym, running on a treadmill, walking to her dormitory in the evening light. Each photo taken from distances that suggested surveillance rather than coincidence, angles that implied the photographer had been watching for extended periods. On the back of each photo was a single word, written in Dominic's distinctive handwriting. Words that formed a message when arranged in order. "You're never really alone anymore, Marina." She examined each photograph with clinical detachment, noting angles that revealed positions, timestamps visible in some shots that established patterns, reflections in windows that identified the photographer. Felix's watch was visible in one reflection, distinctive enough to serve as evidence if needed. She placed the photos carefully in her bag, additions to a file that was growing thicker each day, documentation that might prove useful later when the facade finally cracked and everyone's true nature was revealed. Lunch brought the next escalation. The cafeteria was packed with Thornfield's complex social hierarchy, arranged across tables like a three-dimensional chessboard, where every move had implications. Marina took her usual tray, a salad she'd learned to make last through the entire period, and headed for a corner table that provided good sightlines while limiting approach vectors. She'd barely sat down when Brick appeared, his massive frame blocking out the overhead fluorescent lights and casting her in shadow. "The table's taken," he rumbled, despite the obvious absence of any other occupants or belongings that might suggest prior claim. "Then they're remarkably late." Marina began eating with mechanical precision, each bite calculated to provide maximum nutrition while minimizing vulnerability, never looking away from him long enough to create an opening. Brick reached for her tray with the casual confidence of someone who'd performed this particular humiliation dozens of times before, intending to dump its contents in her lap in a recreation of countless demonstrations of power he'd enacted over the years. His hand never reached its target. Marina's movement was so small, so economical, that witnesses would later argue about what exactly had happened. Some swore she hadn't moved at all, that Brick had simply stumbled. Others claimed to have seen her hand twitch, nothing more. But Brick knew exactly what had happened. The precise application of pressure to specific nerve clusters in his wrist that sent shooting pain up his arm and made his fingers go numb. He stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest, staring at her in shock while she continued eating as if nothing had happened. The cafeteria had gone silent, hundreds of eyes watching this unprecedented scene. A girl who couldn't weigh more than 110 pounds had just made Brick Henley retreat without even standing up. Phones appeared like mushrooms after rain, everyone wanting to capture whatever happened next. Brick looked around for support, finding Dominic standing by the entrance with an expression that promised consequences. The quarterback made a small gesture, calling off whatever Brick had been planning to do next. This required reconsideration, a new approach that took into account the possibility that Marina Keene was not what she appeared to be. The rest of lunch passed in tense silence, Marina finishing her salad while Brick retreated to nurse his mysteriously injured wrist and wounded pride. The video clips were already spreading through group chats and social media, tagged with variations of New Girl vs. Brick and David and Goliath Thornfield edition. But Dominic Blackwood didn't become the apex predator of Thornfield Institute by accepting defeat. He spent the afternoon recalibrating his approach, recognizing that Marina Keene wasn't going to break from conventional pressure. She required something special, something that would crack her perfect composure and reveal whatever she was hiding behind that mask of polite indifference. The plan crystallized during football practice while his teammates ran drills and he stood on the sidelines, supposedly nursing a minor shoulder strain, but actually coordinating with Felix via encrypted messages. Felix had spent the afternoon diving deeper into Marina's background through methods that definitely violated several federal laws and probably a few international ones. His findings were interesting enough to make him forget about the throbbing in his wrist from whatever she'd done to Brick. "There's a gap in her records," Felix reported when they met after practice in the parking lot, the setting sun painting everything in shades of orange and red that looked like dried blood. 6 months when she was 14, where she just doesn't exist in any system I can access. Then she reappears in Budapest with a different last name, then changes back to Keene 2 months later. The paperwork is too perfect, like someone was trying very hard to make it look authentic. "Witness protection," Ryder suggested, showing more intelligence than his grades would indicate. His father beat someone to death and they had to disappear, or something more interesting. Felix pulled up a news article from 3 years ago on his tablet, the screen brightness turned down to avoid attracting attention. Munich, 3 men found dead in an alley behind a coffee shop. Professional execution-style kills. No witnesses, no evidence, except for a partial boot print that matched a size 6 women's shoe. Same day Marina's gap in records begins. Dominic studied the article, his mind already working through possibilities and implications. So our little ballerina has secrets. Perfect. Everyone breaks when their secrets are threatened with exposure. The truth is often more dangerous than any physical threat. They agreed to meet Thursday after school at the McDonald's just off campus, the one place where Thornfield security cameras couldn't reach, but where enough students hung out that any confrontation would have maximum witnesses. Dominic wanted an audience for Marina's humiliation, needed them to restore his reputation and demonstrate that nobody, regardless of their mysterious past or hidden capabilities, could challenge his authority and survive socially. Tuesday and Wednesday passed with electric tension that made the air feel thick and dangerous. The entire school was aware that something was building between Dominic's crew and the new girl, who'd somehow become the first person to successfully resist them. Bets were placed in secret group chats about how it would end, with most favoring Marina's inevitable capitulation or transfer to another school. A few optimists bet on her somehow surviving until graduation, but nobody was willing to put money on her actually winning whatever was coming. She maintained her routine with robotic precision throughout both days. Classes attended with perfect punctuality, notes taken in that same mechanical handwriting, assignments completed with an attention to detail that suggested she was clinging to normalcy as a life raft in stormy seas. If she noticed the increasing surveillance, the way Felix's car appeared wherever she went like a particularly persistent shadow, she gave no indication. Her expression remained neutral, her interactions minimal, her focus absolute. Thursday arrived with gray skies that threatened rain, the kind of atmospheric foreshadowing that would have been rejected as too obvious in a screenplay, but which reality seemed to have no problem providing. Marina attended her classes as usual, answered questions when called upon, with responses that demonstrated not just understanding, but mastery of the material, took notes that could have been used as textbooks themselves. At 3:47 in the afternoon, she was sitting in a back booth at McDonald's with a Happy Meal spread before her, the toy still in its plastic wrapper like a preserved piece of childhood she was saving for later. Her attention seemed focused entirely on the chemistry homework she was completing between bites of chicken nuggets, each equation solved with the same precision she applied to everything else. The choice of a Happy Meal was deliberate, calculated to project an image of harmlessness and youth that might make witnesses more sympathetic to whatever was about to happen. Anyone who'd seen her disable Brick's wrist with a twitch would know better, but the other patrons, the normal people just trying to get their afternoon caffeine fix, would see exactly what she wanted them to see. A small young girl being confronted by 5 large athletic boys. The optics were perfect. The Thornfield elite entered at 3:52, their coordination suggesting military precision, despite none of them having served anything more dangerous than detention. They spread through the restaurant with practiced efficiency that would have been impressive if it weren't so obviously rehearsed. Preston took position at the main entrance, his designer clothes and expensive watch making him look like he was slumming just by being in a McDonald's. Ryder covered the side exit that led to the parking lot, his bulk ensuring nobody could leave without going through him. Felix positioned himself where he could record everything on his phone while appearing to scroll through social media. Brick and Dominic approached her booth directly, their shadows falling across her homework like storm clouds, finally delivering on their threat of rain. Marina didn't look up from her chemistry equations, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Her weight redistributed slightly, her breathing pattern changed to something deeper and more controlled, and her grip on her pencil adjusted to something that wasn't quite proper for writing, but would be perfect for driving it through someone's carotid artery. These were changes too subtle for the boys to notice, but the McDonald's manager, a veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to manage a fast food restaurant, recognized the signs of someone preparing for violence. His hand drifted toward the phone behind the counter, already composing the 911 call in his head. Dominic slid into the booth across from Marina with the kind of casual arrogance that suggested he owned not just the seat, but the entire restaurant. The vinyl squeaked under his designer jeans, a sound that would have been comical if the tension hadn't been thick enough to cut with a knife. Brick remained standing, using his size to ensure nobody could leave without going through him, which several patrons were already considering as they recognized the dynamics of what was about to unfold. Marina still didn't look up, her voice carrying the kind of disinterested professionalism of someone conducting a mildly boring experiment. The molecular structure of McDonald's food provides an interesting case study in how nutritional value degrades under extreme heat stress. The frying process breaks down complex proteins into simpler compounds that are easier to digest but provide less sustained energy. It's actually quite fascinating from a biochemical perspective. Dominic reached across the table and closed her textbook with deliberate slowness, the gesture loaded with threat and entitlement. "We're not here to discuss your homework, Marina. We're here to discuss your education in how Thornfield really works, beyond the classrooms and textbooks and whatever fantasies you've been maintaining about being left alone." Now she raised her eyes, and something in them made Brick shift uncomfortably, despite his size advantage. It was the look of someone who'd seen real violence, who understood that what these boys considered intimidation was just theater, a performance of power rather than its reality. Felix had moved closer, his phone angled to capture every moment while appearing to text someone. Ryder and Preston maintained their positions at the exits, their presence turning the family restaurant into an arena where something significant was about to be decided. Several other Thornfield students had noticed what was happening and had their phones out, sensing that whatever came next would be worth recording. "You've been at Thornfield for 3 weeks, Dominic said, leaning forward in what he considered an intimidating manner, but which Marina recognized as leaving him perfectly positioned for a throat strike. 3 weeks of disrespect, of acting like the natural order doesn't apply to you, like you're somehow above the system that everyone else accepts. That ends today. One way or another, you're going to learn your place." Marina picked up a chicken nugget, examined it with scientific interest, then took a small, precise bite. "Natural order implies evolution and adaptation. You're more like a vestigial organ, something that used to serve a purpose, but now just takes up space waiting to be removed when it becomes inflamed." The comparison was delivered with such casual dismissal that several nearby students actually laughed before catching themselves. Dominic's jaw tightened, the muscles working in a way that suggested he was grinding his teeth hard enough to require dental work later. "You think you're untouchable?" That little trick with Brick's wrist was impressive, but luck runs out, especially when you're outnumbered 5-1 in a space with no room to maneuver. Actually, Marina wiped her fingers on a napkin with methodical care. "It's 5-2. Dominic glanced around, confused by the math. Me and physics. You see, force equals mass times acceleration, but that assumes linear movement in a single direction. When you introduce rotational dynamics, leverage points, and an understanding of human anatomy's structural weaknesses, mass becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The bigger you are, the more points of failure you present." Brick actually laughed at that, the sound rumbling through the restaurant like distant thunder. "Is she seriously giving us a physics lesson right now? Like we're in class?" That's when Dominic made his critical error, the mistake that would cost him full use of his right arm for the next 6 months. He reached across the table, his hand moving toward Marina's hair with the same possessive entitlement he'd shown with dozens of girls before her, the gesture that had always established dominance and control. His fingers barely grazed a strand of honey blonde hair before everything changed. The security footage, which the manager would later provide to 3 different law enforcement agencies and which would eventually be leaked online, where it would accumulate 47 million views in the first week, showed the timestamp at 15:56:14 when Dominic's hand made contact. By 15:56:21.8, the confrontation was over, and all 5 boys were on the ground in various states of consciousness and medical distress. Marina's movement began with her right hand, not forming a fist, but keeping the fingers extended as she drove them into the pressure point located just below Dominic's elbow joint. The strike was delivered with enough force to hyperextend the joint beyond its normal range of motion, causing immediate nerve damage that would require multiple surgeries to partially correct. The pain was so intense and unexpected that Dominic's scream was cut short by his inability to draw breath, his nervous system too overwhelmed to remember how lungs worked. Brick's instinct to protect his quarterback overrode tactical sense, and he lunged forward with the kind of reckless aggression that worked on football fields, but not against someone who'd been trained in 3 different martial arts before she learned to drive. Marina's Happy Meal tray became a weapon in motion, the edge catching Brick in the throat at the exact point where the vagus nerve is closest to the surface. The strike wouldn't cause permanent damage. She'd been careful about that, but it would drop him instantly as his blood pressure plummeted, and his brain decided consciousness was optional. All 300 pounds of him hit the floor with enough force to crack the tiles, his hands clutching his throat as he tried to remember the mechanics of breathing. Ryder abandoned his post at the side exit, charging forward with the same aggressive speed that had earned him a reputation for devastating tackles. Marina pivoted on her heel, using the booth's table as a fulcrum to generate rotational force. Her foot connected with his knee from an angle that human joints weren't designed to accommodate, specifically targeting the anterior cruciate ligament with surgical precision. The sound of tearing tissue was audible throughout the restaurant, followed immediately by Ryder's scream as he collapsed, his football career ending in a McDonald's with the smell of French fries and the taste of failure. Preston, despite his father's money and connections providing a lifetime of insulation from consequences, discovered that wealth offered no protection against someone who understood violence as both art and science. He made the mistake of trying to grab her from behind, a move that might have worked on someone who hadn't spent years training to counter exactly that kind of attack. Marina didn't even look at him, simply drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus with enough force to empty his lungs, then grabbed his wrist and used his own momentum to drive his face into the edge of a neighboring table. The sound of his nose breaking was wet and distinctive, followed by immediate unconsciousness as his brain decided to temporarily shut down rather than process the trauma. Felix, the smart one, the psychological warfare specialist, stood frozen with his phone still recording. He'd studied violence academically, understood it theoretically, but had never seen it deployed with such casual efficiency. Marina turned to face him, her hand moving toward his throat, but stopping millimeters from his carotid artery, close enough that he could feel the displaced air from what would have been a killing strike if she'd chosen to complete it. "Still recording?" she asked pleasantly, as if they were discussing homework rather than standing in the aftermath of what looked like a war zone. He nodded, unable to form words, his throat working but producing no sound. "Good. Make sure you get their medical treatment in frame. It helps with the self-defense claim, especially the part where 5 male athletes surrounded and threatened a single female student who was just trying to eat her Happy Meal in peace." She returned to her booth and sat down as calmly as if she'd simply gotten up to refill her drink. Around her, chaos reigned. Brick was making sounds that resembled a broken bagpipe as his respiratory system tried to recalibrate. Ryder was screaming about his knee, the joint already swelling to twice its normal size. Preston remained unconscious, blood pooling beneath his face in a spreading puddle that would require professional cleaning to fully remove. Dominic had curled into a fetal position, cradling his destroyed arm while making high-pitched keening sounds that didn't seem like they should come from someone his size. The manager had already called 911, his voice steady and professional as he reported multiple casualties requiring immediate medical attention, possible assault, though the security footage would clearly show self-defense. Other students stood frozen, their phones capturing every angle of the aftermath, the videos already uploading to social media, where they would spark debates about proportional response, self-defense laws, and whether Marina Keene was a hero or a psychopath. Marina picked up another chicken nugget, taking a small bite while surveying the damage with professional detachment. The precision of her strikes had been deliberate, calculated to cause maximum immediate distress while avoiding permanent disability, mostly. Ryder would need complete knee reconstruction and would probably never play football again, but he'd walk normally within a year if he followed his physical therapy religiously. Dominic's arm would require multiple surgeries and would never have full range of motion again, but he'd retain enough function for daily activities. The others would recover completely, physically at least. Psychologically was another matter entirely. 3 police cars arrived first, followed by 2 ambulances, then a third when they realized the extent of the injuries. The officers entered with hands on their weapons, expecting an active threat, but found only a small blonde girl eating a Happy Meal, while 5 football players writhed on the floor around her. The scene was so incongruous that one officer actually laughed before catching himself, the sound inappropriate but understandable given the circumstances. Then the unmarked sedan arrived, the kind of vehicle that screamed federal government to anyone who knew what to look for. The woman who stepped out moved with the kind of purposeful efficiency that came from years of training in places that didn't officially exist. She wore a conservative suit that did nothing to hide the shoulder holster beneath it, and her eyes swept the scene with the kind of assessment that cataloged threats, exits, and potential complications in seconds. She showed her credentials to the local police, FBI badges carrying weight that moved them aside without argument. Then she approached Marina's booth with the careful respect one professional shows another, sitting down across from her without invitation, but also without presumption. The Happy Meal toys sat between them like a bizarre centerpiece for a conversation that was about to venture into classified territory. Sarah Chen was her cover name, though Marina suspected she had dozens of others depending on the situation. Her real name was probably buried in a file that required presidential authorization to access. She pulled out a tablet that displayed footage not from the McDonald's security cameras, but from a satellite feed that had been monitoring Marina's movements for the past 3 weeks, possibly longer. That was Systema combined with Krav Maga, Sarah observed, her tone conversational, but her eyes sharp. The throat strike was textbook Spetsnaz training. The knee destruction was Filipino martial arts, Kali specifically. Mind telling me where a 17-year-old ballet dancer from Budapest learned combat techniques from 3 different military traditions? Marina took another bite of her nugget, chewing slowly while she considered her response. YouTube is very educational these days. They have tutorials for everything. Want to learn how to disable 5 athletes in under 8 seconds? There's probably a video for that. Like and subscribe for more content. Sarah smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. 3 years ago, Munich. 3 dead contractors from the Vorokov network found in an alley. Witnesses reported a teenage girl at the scene who disappeared before local police arrived. The partial boot print matched a size 6 woman's shoe, designer label that was only sold in 7 stores worldwide, one of which was in Budapest, where you were supposedly attending ballet school. Marina remained silent, her expression revealing nothing but her mind cataloging how much they knew, how much they suspected, and how much she could admit without compromising ongoing operations. Sarah continued, each revelation, another card laid on the table in a game where the stakes were significantly higher than either of them was acknowledging. 2 years ago, Prague. A human trafficking ring targeting international students gets exposed when someone sends detailed financial records to Interpol. The metadata traces back to a computer in a youth hostel where a girl matching your description stayed for exactly 1 night. The girl paid cash, provided fake identification that was good enough to pass casual inspection, and was never seen again. Interesting story. Marina's voice carried just a hint of her real accent, something harder and more Eastern European than her usual careful pronunciation. Sounds like something from a spy novel, very dramatic. 18 months ago, Berlin. Sarah's tablet displayed satellite imagery of a building Marina recognized but wouldn't acknowledge. A terrorist cell planning an attack on a diplomatic summit finds their safe house compromised. The only surveillance footage shows someone your height and build leaving the building 5 minutes before it exploded from a gas leak that forensics said was impossibly accidental. 23 terrorists dead, an attack prevented, and no one to thank for it. The medals they wanted to give had to go in a file marked with a question mark. Marina finished her last nugget and began carefully cleaning her fingers with a napkin, each movement precise and deliberate. You seem to be suggesting something, Agent Chen, or whatever your real name is. I'm suggesting that Marina Keene isn't your real name, that your father isn't just in international finance, and that you're here for reasons that have nothing to do with academic excellence. Though maintaining a perfect GPA while conducting surveillance operations is impressive multitasking. The restaurant had been cleared of civilians now, leaving only law enforcement and medical personnel. Through the windows, Marina could see news vans arriving, drawn by social media reports of violence at Thornfield Institute's favorite after-school hangout. The story would be spun a dozen different ways by morning, but the video evidence was clear. 5 male athletes had surrounded and threatened a single female student who had defended herself with devastating efficiency. "My name is legally Marina Keene," she said carefully, each word chosen with precision. "My father does work in international finance, among other things, and I am here for education, just not necessarily the kind found in textbooks, though I do find the chemistry curriculum surprisingly engaging." Sarah's tablet beeped with an incoming message. She read it, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Interesting. Dominic Blackwood's father just called the governor, the state attorney general, and someone at the Justice Department demanding your arrest for assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Meanwhile, Felix Ashford's phone has been remotely wiped, presumably by you, despite your claim to have been eating nuggets at the time." I was eating nuggets. Marina's smile was small but genuine. It's amazing what you can do with phones these days. Send texts, make calls, remotely access other devices, and delete incriminating evidence of systematic harassment and conspiracy to commit assault. Technology is wonderful. The manager's security system uploaded everything to a cloud server that coincidentally belongs to a company that doesn't officially exist but has ties to certain three-letter agencies, almost like someone wanted to ensure the footage survived any local interference. "Did you know that most McDonald's security systems have that feature?" Marina asked innocently. "It's for loss prevention and liability purposes. Very practical." Sarah stood, leaving a business card on the table. Not the one identifying her as FBI, but one with just a phone number and a symbol that Marina recognized from classified briefings her father had never officially shown her, documents that didn't exist about operations that never happened. The Vorokov network has been trying to establish operations in American prep schools for 3 years, recruiting privileged kids with criminal tendencies, identifying future leaders they can corrupt before they reach positions of power. Thornfield was supposed to be their test case, their proof of concept before expanding to the entire East Coast. Marina processed this information, pieces clicking into place that she'd been gathering for weeks. Felix Ashford's sealed juvenile records included connections to Eastern European IP addresses. Preston Vale's father had been receiving payments from shell companies linked to Vorokov money laundering operations. Ryder had been in contact with known Vorokov recruiters through encrypted messaging apps he thought were secure. Even Brick had been identified as potential muscle for their American operations. The whole Thornfield elite was being groomed, though only Felix understood the full scope of what they were part of. "So you knew who I was from the beginning," Marina said. Not a question, but a confirmation of something she'd suspected since her second day, when she'd noticed the same unmarked car in 3 different locations. "We knew someone was coming. Your handler in Budapest has been in contact with us for months. Project Haven isn't as secret as your father thinks. The plan to give Asset's children normal lives, to let them experience adolescence without looking over their shoulders, it's admirable. But when those children have been trained since childhood to identify and neutralize threats, normal becomes relative. You weren't sent here just for your protection. You were sent here because your particular skills would be useful when Thornfield's infection finally needed to be burned out." Through the window, Marina watched the boys being loaded into ambulances. Dominic was conscious but sedated, his arm immobilized in a way that suggested multiple surgeries in his future. Brick's breathing had stabilized, but he'd need observation for potential tracheal damage. Ryder's knee was already swollen to the size of a cantaloupe, the joint destroyed beyond what sports medicine could fully repair. Preston had regained consciousness, but seemed confused, probably concussed, definitely needing extensive dental work. Felix stood with the police, having turned over his phone and already negotiating some kind of deal through lawyers who'd appeared with suspicious speed. "They were being groomed as assets," Sarah continued. "The Vorokov network identified them as ideal candidates, privileged enough to reach positions of power, sociopathic enough to be useful, arrogant enough to be easily controlled through blackmail and financial incentives. Felix was their star recruit, the one they were training for intelligence work. The others were meant for different roles. Dominic would have gone into politics or law, positions where he could influence policy. Preston's construction empire would have been used for laundering money and providing infrastructure for trafficking operations. Ryder and Brick were muscle, future enforcers who would have institutional protection. And now? Marina asked, though she already knew the answer. The videos of what had happened were spreading across the internet like wildfire, each share and comment adding to a narrative that would destroy any future political or business ambitions the boys might have harbored. Now there will be investigations. Federal agents were already entering the restaurant, beginning the process of documenting everything. Dominic's father will resign to focus on his family after encrypted communications reveal his knowledge of his son's activities and payments received to ensure silence. Preston's father will flee to a non-extradition country, abandoning his son to face conspiracy charges as an adult. Felix will turn state's evidence in exchange for witness protection, his testimony revealing recruiting methods and expansion plans that will prevent the Vorokov network from establishing a foothold in American schools. The infection will be burned out, and Thornfield will be cleaned. Marina stood, leaving her Happy Meal tray on the table like evidence at a crime scene. And me? What happens to the girl who just destroyed 5 football players in a McDonald's? The videos are already viral. My cover is blown. Marina Keene can't exactly return to calculus class tomorrow and pretend nothing happened. Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. No, Marina Keene can't. But there are other schools, other infections that need to be burned out. The Vorokov network isn't the only organization trying to corrupt the next generation of American leadership. Consider this your final exam at Thornfield. You passed with flying colors, or rather, with broken bones and viral videos. Sarah placed a folder on the table, thick with documents and photographs. Marina opened it, scanning information about Blackstone Preparatory Academy in Massachusetts, about missing students and sealed police reports, about connections to human trafficking rings that made the Vorokov network look like amateurs playing at being criminals. The folder also contained a new identity, complete with transcripts from a boarding school in Switzerland and a tragic backstory about parents killed in an avalanche. If I do this, Marina said, closing the folder but not returning it, I want something in return. Sarah nodded, having expected negotiation. Assets always had a price, even teenage ones. Name it. There's a girl in Munich, Elsa Voronova, 15 years old. Her father was one of the men who died in that alley 3 years ago. She's been in hiding since then, moving between safe houses, never staying anywhere long enough to have friends or go to school or be a normal teenager. I want her brought here, given the same chance I was given, the chance to be more than collateral damage in her father's choices. Sarah considered this, weighing the costs and benefits of importing another potentially dangerous teenager with unknown training and loyalties. She deserves a life that isn't defined by violence and vengeance. Marina's voice carried an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. No child should grow up the way we did, always looking over our shoulders, always ready to fight or run. If you can give her that, I'll burn out as many infections as you need. They stood in the McDonald's, surrounded by the aftermath of violence that had been precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum permanent damage, mostly. 2 professionals who'd seen too much violence pretending to be a federal agent and a teenage student, negotiating the terms of a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. I'll make it happen, Sarah finally said. Elsa Voronova will be enrolled at a safe school within the month, with a new identity and a chance at the normal life she deserves. The door chimed as a new customer entered, apparently not deterred by the police tape and evidence markers. A girl, maybe 17, with raven black hair and the kind of balanced movement that suggested dance training or something more practical. She ordered a coffee, black, no sugar, and chose a booth where she could watch every entrance while appearing to read a book written in Cyrillic script. Marina and Sarah exchanged glances, both recognizing the same signs, the same training, the same careful positioning that suggested someone who'd learned to treat every space as a potential battlefield. She's not one of ours, Sarah said quietly, already pulling up information on her phone. Vera Mikhailova, Marina read from the folder Sarah showed her. Transferred from a private academy in Moscow yesterday. Father in international banking. Mother deceased. Living with an aunt in Greenwich who doesn't exist before last week. The girl looked up, meeting Marina's gaze directly across the restaurant. For a moment, Something passed between them. Recognition without knowledge, understanding without words. Then she returned to her book, dismissing them as unimportant, though Marina knew better. She recognized a hunter pretending to be prey, a weapon disguised as a student, another teenager who'd been robbed of childhood and given violence in its place. Moscow doesn't transfer students in the middle of term, Marina observed, not without very good reasons. And they certainly don't send them to schools that just had their criminal recruitment pipeline exposed on social media. Sarah was already texting someone, her fingers flying across her phone's screen. Vera Mikhailova doesn't exist in any of our databases before last week. It's like she appeared from nowhere, fully formed with a perfect legend and enrollment at a school that shouldn't even be accepting students given the ongoing federal investigation. Marina smiled, remembering her own arrival at Thornfield with carefully crafted documentation that had fooled everyone until she'd wanted to be discovered. Sometimes nowhere is exactly where the most dangerous people come from. We're trained in places that don't exist, by people who were never there, to do things that never happened. Then we're sent into the world with false names and fake histories, told to be normal teenagers while we wait for the violence to find us. And it always finds us, because that's what we were made for. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She read it once, then activated an app that destroyed the message and any trace it had existed, though not before memorizing its contents. Phase 1 complete. Athens awaits. She looked back through McDonald's windows to where Vera sat reading her book, coffee untouched, attention seemingly focused on the Cyrillic text, but Marina knew better. She recognized the subtle signs of someone cataloging every person in the restaurant, measuring distances, identifying potential weapons disguised as everyday items. Athens? Sarah asked, having noticed Marina's reaction to the message. It's a protocol, Marina replied carefully. One that doesn't officially exist, run by people who aren't officially anywhere, training children who officially were never born. If Vera is part of Athens, then Thornfield was just the beginning. This is bigger than the Vorokov network, bigger than criminal recruitment. This is about something else entirely. She turned to leave, then paused. The girl, Elsa. Make sure she's placed somewhere safe, somewhere far from whatever Athens is planning. She's been through enough. She deserves a chance at peace. As Marina walked toward the exit, she passed Vera's table. The other girl didn't look up, but her sleeve rode up slightly as she turned a page, revealing not just a scar identical to Marina's own, but something else. A small tattoo in Cyrillic script that Marina recognized from classified documents that didn't exist. The symbol of the Athens Protocol, a program so secret that even mentioning its name in the wrong company could result in disappearance. Outside in the parking lot, Marina stood in the fading daylight, watching through the window as Sarah approached Vera's table with the careful respect one predator shows another. Whatever came next, whatever Athens had planned, Marina understood that her time as a normal teenager was over before it had really begun. But then again, she'd never really been normal. Normal teenagers didn't disable 5 athletes in under 8 seconds. Normal teenagers didn't have files on their family histories that required presidential authorization to access. Normal teenagers didn't get recruited to burn out infections in America's elite institutions. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a number she recognized. Her handler, the man she called father when anyone was listening, checking in from whatever European city he was currently pretending to work in. She didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be intercepted, analyzed, and filed by at least 3 different intelligence agencies. Instead, she typed a simple message. Haven compromised. Athens active. Elsa must be protected. Then she destroyed the phone entirely, dropping the pieces in 3 different trash cans as she walked toward her dormitory. Behind her, the McDonald's continued to process as a crime scene, though the only crime had been 5 boys discovering that their privilege and protection meant nothing against someone trained to see violence as an equation to be solved. The news vans were already broadcasting, their reporters struggling to explain how a 110-pound girl had hospitalized 5 Division I athletic recruits without receiving a single injury herself. The videos would be analyzed by experts who would use terms like proportional response and self-defense, while carefully avoiding the obvious truth that Marina Keene had held back, that if she'd wanted to, those boys would be dead rather than damaged. At Thornfield Institute, students gathered in small groups, sharing videos and theories about who Marina Keene really was. Some said she was a government experiment, a super soldier created in a lab and placed in their school as a test. Others claimed she was an alien, her small size and incredible strength evidence of non-human origin. A few, the ones who paid attention to international news and had parents in certain government agencies, whispered about black sites and training programs, about children raised as weapons and unleashed on unsuspecting targets. They were all wrong, and they were all right in their own ways. Marina Keene was exactly what she appeared to be, a 17-year-old girl trying to complete her education. She was also a highly trained operative who'd been preventing international crime since she was 14. She was a daughter who'd lost her mother to violence and had been shaped by that loss into something dangerous. She was a teenager who wanted nothing more than to be normal, but had accepted that normal was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she reached her dormitory, Marina saw a familiar car parked outside. Sarah Chen stood beside it, no longer pretending to be just an FBI agent. She held another folder, thicker than the first, and her expression suggested that Marina's night was far from over. "Change of plans," Sarah said without preamble. Athens Protocol just activated cells in 12 schools across the country. Synchronized enrollment of assets, all with perfect legends, all with skills similar to yours. We don't know what they're planning, but having that many weapons positioned in elite institutions isn't about recruitment or corruption. It's about something bigger. Marina took the folder, opening it to reveal photographs of 12 teenagers, all between 15 and 18, all with the kind of perfect features and expensive clothing that would let them blend seamlessly into America's most exclusive schools. But Marina saw past the surface, recognizing the signs she'd been trained to identify. The way they held themselves in the photos, the careful positioning that suggested constant awareness of their surroundings, the dead eyes that came from seeing too much violence too young. "They're not here to recruit," Marina said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "They're here to eliminate. Someone has decided that America's next generation of leaders is too corrupted to save, so they're going to remove them entirely. Replace them with their own assets, trained from birth to follow orders without question. It's not infiltration, it's substitution." Sarah nodded grimly. "Every one of these kids has a body count. They've been operating in Europe and Asia for years, eliminating targets that threatened Athens Protocol's expansion. Now they're here, positioned in schools where they'll have access to senators' children, future presidents, tomorrow's CEOs. And we can't move against them without proof, without understanding their endgame." Marina closed the folder, her mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. "You want me to find them, identify their targets, and stop them before they complete whatever Athens has planned. One 17-year-old girl against 12 trained killers, all while maintaining my cover and keeping my grades up. Should be fun." "You won't be alone," Sarah assured her. "We're activating other assets, bringing in resources from programs you don't even know exist. But you're our best chance at understanding Athens Protocol because you think like them, fight like them, understand the mentality of children raised as weapons." Marina looked back toward the McDonald's, where crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze like yellow flags of surrender. 5 boys had learned today that their power was an illusion, that real strength came from training and discipline, and the willingness to do violence with precision. Tomorrow, 12 trained killers would be sitting in classrooms across America, pretending to be normal teenagers while they selected targets and waited for orders. The war for America's future wasn't going to be fought on battlefields or in Congress. It was going to be fought in prep school hallways and dormitories by teenagers who'd been trained to kill before they'd learned to kiss. And Marina Keene, or whatever her real name had been before the violence claimed it, was going to be on the front lines. She thought about Elsa Voronova, hiding in a Munich safe house, moving every few weeks to stay ahead of whoever wanted her dead, for her father's sins. She thought about her own mother, dead in a Bucharest hotel room, because she'd been standing too close to the wrong person at the wrong time. She thought about all the children trained by Athens Protocol, their childhood sacrifice to create perfect weapons for someone else's war. "When do I start?" Marina asked, though she already knew the answer. The war had already started the moment Vera Mikhailova had walked into that McDonald's and ordered her coffee black. It had started when 12 teenagers with perfect legends and deadly skills had enrolled in America's most exclusive schools. It had started long before Marina had broken Dominic Blackwood's arm, back when someone had decided that the best way to shape the future was to eliminate anyone who might oppose their vision. "Tonight," Sarah said, handing her car keys and a new phone. "Vera Mikhailova has a meeting scheduled at midnight, location to be determined. We need to know who she's meeting and why. Can you follow her without being detected?" Marina almost laughed at the question. She'd been following targets through European cities since she was 12, learning to be invisible in crowds, to blend into backgrounds, to become so unremarkable that even trained observers would forget she was there. "I'll need different clothes," Marina said, already mentally cataloging what she'd need. "And someone to handle my alibis at Thornfield. If I'm going to be hunting Athens Protocol assets, I can't also be maintaining perfect attendance." Sarah smiled, producing another set of keys. "There's an apartment downtown, fully stocked with everything you'll need. Your classes have been handled, medical emergency and the family requiring extended absence. Your grades won't suffer." As Marina walked toward the car that would take her to her new base of operations, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. She'd been trained to fight, to survive, to complete missions and eliminate threats, but she'd never been trained to hunt her own kind, to fight other children who'd been shaped by the same violence that had created her. Athens Protocol didn't just represent a threat to America's future leaders. It represented a mirror, showing Marina what she could have become if her handlers had been less careful with her humanity. The drive downtown took 20 minutes through evening traffic, giving Marina time to review the files on the Athens Protocol assets. Each one had a story similar to hers: parents killed in violence, children saved and trained by shadowy organizations, shaped into weapons before they understood what childhood was supposed to be. They were all victims who'd been transformed into threats, and Marina was expected to stop them, possibly kill them, definitely destroy their operations. The apartment Sarah had mentioned turned out to be a penthouse in a building that didn't appear on any official city registries. The elevator required biometric authentication and a code that changed every 12 hours. Inside, Marina found an arsenal disguised as a luxury apartment, weapons hidden in furniture, surveillance equipment built into the walls, and a computer system that could access databases that technically didn't exist. She changed quickly, trading her school uniform for clothes that would let her blend into any environment. Dark jeans, nondescript jacket, shoes that looked normal but could handle running, climbing, or fighting. She equipped herself with tools that wouldn't show up on metal detectors or casual searches, things that looked like everyday items but could become weapons in trained hands. By 11:30, she was positioned outside the coffee shop where Vera had been sitting, now closed but with apartments above it that provided perfect vantage points. Marina had picked the lock on a roof access door, a skill learned in Prague when she was 13, and needed to escape pursuit by climbing through the city's rooftops. She settled in to wait, knowing that patience was often the difference between success and discovery. At 11:58, Vera emerged from a building 3 blocks away, moving with purpose but not haste. Marina followed from the rooftops, a shadow among shadows, tracking her target through streets that were empty except for the occasional drunk student stumbling home from parties. Vera moved like someone who knew she was being followed but didn't care, which either meant she was supremely confident or leading Marina into a trap. The meeting point turned out to be an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of place where violence could happen without witnesses or interruption. Marina counted 6 other figures converging on the location, all moving with the same trained precision as Vera. Athens Protocol assets, gathering for something that required face-to-face coordination rather than digital communication. Marina found a ventilation grate that gave her audio access to the warehouse interior. She attached a listening device that would transmit to her phone while she maintained visual surveillance through a broken window. What she heard over the next hour would reshape her understanding of the threat Athens Protocol represented. They weren't planning assassinations, at least not in the traditional sense. They were planning something far more insidious, a systematic replacement of key students with their own assets. Not killing them, but destroying them through scandals, addiction, mental breakdowns carefully orchestrated to remove them from positions of future influence. Then Athens Protocol assets would step into the voids, positioned to influence American policy for the next generation. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, Vera was saying, her accent barely detectable. Marina has been neutralized, her cover blown, her usefulness ended. She'll be too busy playing hero to notice what we're really doing. The others have integrated successfully into their assigned schools. Within 6 months, we'll have removed or compromised every significant future leader in the American pipeline. Marina recorded everything, already composing the report she'd send to Sarah. But as she listened to children planning the destruction of other children, she realized something that chilled her more than any threat she'd faced. Athens Protocol hadn't just trained these assets to be weapons. They'd trained them to enjoy it, to take pleasure in the destruction of others, to see violence not as a necessary evil, but as an art form to be perfected. She'd thought she was hunting versions of herself, children forced into violence who might be saved if given the chance. But these weren't victims anymore. They were true believers, convinced that their mission was righteous, that destroying America's future leaders was somehow saving the world from their corruption. There would be no reasoning with them, no appeals to their humanity, because Athens Protocol had carefully removed that humanity and replaced it with purpose. The meeting ended at 2 a.m, the assets dispersing into the night like poison spreading through a bloodstream. Marina followed Vera back toward Greenwich, maintaining surveillance until her target entered a mansion that supposedly belonged to an aunt, but which Marina now knew was an Athens Protocol safe house. She documented everything, noting security measures, possible entry points, and the presence of at least 3 other assets in the building. By dawn, Marina was back in her penthouse apartment, composing a report that would trigger the largest domestic intelligence operation in American history. 13 Athens Protocol assets, positioned in schools across the country, planning to systematically destroy the next generation of American leadership. It wasn't terrorism in any traditional sense, but something more subtle and ultimately more dangerous. They weren't trying to destroy buildings or kill innocents. They were trying to reshape America's future by controlling who would lead it. Her phone rang as she was finishing the report. Sarah's voice was tense, urgent. "We have a problem. Felix Ashford is dead. Apparent suicide, but the forensics don't add up. His testimony was going to expose the entire Vorokov network. Without it, we lose our case against everyone except the boys you took down." Marina understood immediately. Athens Protocol was cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could expose the larger conspiracy. Felix had known too much, been too willing to trade information for protection. They'd silenced him and made it look self-inflicted, knowing that a troubled teenager committing suicide after a traumatic event would raise no suspicions. "There will be others," Marina said, already thinking through the implications. Anyone who could connect Athens to Vorokov, anyone who might have noticed patterns or asked questions. They're going to clean house before Phase 2 begins, remove any loose ends that might complicate their operation. Sarah's silence suggested she'd reached the same conclusion. Then finally, "You're a loose end, Marina. You've seen too much, know too much. They mentioned you specifically at the meeting, said you'd been neutralized, but we both know that's not enough for them. You're a target now." Marina looked out over the city as the sun rose, painting the skyline in shades of gold and red that reminded her of blood and fire. She'd been hunted before, had spent years looking over her shoulder for threats. But this was different. She wasn't being hunted by criminals or terrorists who wanted her dead for what she'd done. She was being hunted by mirrors of herself, trained killers who understood her tactics because they'd learned from the same teachers, faced the same trials, survived the same brutal training that had forged her into a weapon. "Let them come," she said, surprising herself with the calm in her voice. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be normal when we all know none of us will ever be that. If Athens protocol wants a war, I'll give them one. But on my terms, by my rules. Because there's one thing they don't understand about me. One thing their files and surveillance and intelligence won't tell them." "What's that?" Sarah asked, though Marina could hear something like hope in her voice. "I didn't survive this long by being the best fighter or the smartest operative. I survived by being unpredictable, by doing what nobody expected, by breaking patterns and refusing to play by anyone's rules, even my own handlers. Athens protocol thinks they know me because we were trained the same way, but they don't know what I became after the training ended, when I had to make my own choices about who to be and what to fight for." She ended the call and opened a different file on her computer, one that contained information she'd been gathering for years about programs like Haven and Athens, about children trained as weapons and scattered across the globe like seeds of violence waiting to bloom. It was time to stop being reactive, stop letting others dictate the battlefield. It was time to become what she'd been trained to be, not a student or an asset or a weapon, but something more dangerous. A survivor who'd learned to fight back. The war for America's future had begun in a McDonald's with 5 broken boys and a viral video. But it would end somewhere else, with different players and higher stakes. And Marina Keene, or whatever her real name had once been, would make sure she was the one left standing when the violence finally ended.